Vivian Johnson was 28 years old when her parents walked into her restaurant and expected a free meal. 10 years earlier they had pushed her out of their house with trash bags filled with her belongings. "We can't afford to keep feeding you," her mother had said coldly while standing at the door. Now Vivian was the owner and head chef of a Michelin-starred restaurant called Ember House. When the host quietly told her that a reservation under the Johnson name had arrived, something heavy settled in her chest. She looked through the kitchen window and saw them sitting there. Robert Johnson, Linda Johnson, and her younger sister, Sophie Johnson. Vivian grew up in a quiet town in Ohio where her family looked perfectly ordinary from the outside. Her father, Robert Johnson, worked as an insurance adjuster, and her mother, Linda Johnson, handled bookkeeping for several small businesses in town. Their house was comfortable and stable, and neighbors often described the Johnsons as a happy family. But inside the house, Vivian's experience was very different. From the moment Sophie Johnson was born, the balance inside the family slowly shifted. Almost every decision began revolving around Sophie's needs. Vivian gradually became the quiet child who was expected to manage on her own. When Vivian was 8 years old, she asked her father if she could have a bigger bicycle because the one she owned had already become too small for her. Robert barely glanced up from the television before answering. "We can't afford that right now," he said in a flat voice. 2 weeks later, a large delivery truck stopped in front of their house carrying a beautiful princess-themed bedroom set for Sophie. The hallway filled with bright pink furniture and glittering decorations. Vivian stared at the receipt lying on the kitchen counter. $800. Later that night she quietly asked her mother about it. Linda Johnson sighed as if the question itself was annoying. "Your sister deserves nice things," she said while putting dishes away. Vivian tried to explain that she had only asked for a simple $60 bicycle. Her mother waved her off quickly. "Sophie needs more attention than you do," she said. The message was clear even though no one said it directly. Vivian was expected to accept less. The pattern continued through the years. Vivian wore hand-me-down clothes while Sophie received new outfits every season. Vivian slept in a small crowded room while Sophie enjoyed the largest bedroom in the house. High school became the first place where Vivian discovered something that truly belonged to her. One afternoon she wandered into the school's culinary club and watched students cooking together in the classroom kitchen. The warm smell of butter, garlic, and herbs filled the air. Something inside her immediately felt alive. The club's instructor, Mr. Turner, noticed her standing quietly by the door. "Have you ever tried cooking before?" he asked kindly. Vivian shook her head. Mr. Turner smiled and handed her a knife and a cutting board. "Then today is the perfect day to start," he said. That moment quietly changed her life forever. Vivian returned the next afternoon and every afternoon after that. The kitchen became the only place where she felt noticed for the right reasons. Mr. Turner watched her carefully the first week and then said, "You have natural instincts with food." Vivian didn't fully understand what that meant, but the words stayed with her. While other students joked around, she focused on learning every technique he showed them. One evening she prepared a delicate hollandaise sauce perfectly on her third attempt. Mr. Turner tasted it and raised his eyebrows. "Most students take months to get that right," he said quietly. Cooking gave Vivian something she had never felt at home. In the kitchen she had control and effort produced clear results. If she practiced more, her dishes improved. If she experimented with flavors, something new appeared on the plate. At home, however, nothing had changed. Her parents never came to culinary club events or school cooking showcases. When Vivian won second place in a regional student cooking competition, she carried the small trophy home carefully. Her mother barely glanced at it. "That's nice," Linda said while sorting Sophie's dance costumes. Then she asked Vivian if she had cleaned her room. Just a month later Sophie finished fourth in a local dance competition. The house exploded with celebration that night. Relatives were invited over for dinner and photos were posted all over social media. Vivian quietly watched from the kitchen doorway as her parents congratulated Sophie again and again. "Our daughter is so talented," Robert proudly told their relatives. Vivian stood there holding a glass of lemonade and realized something painful. It was not that her parents could not celebrate success. They simply chose which child deserved celebration. And in their eyes, Vivian had never been that child. By the time Vivian reached her senior year of high school, she knew exactly what she wanted for her future. The Culinary Institute 3 hours away had one of the best programs in the country. Tuition was expensive, but Vivian had been working part-time at a small diner since she turned 16. After 2 years of saving tips and wages, she had managed to put aside almost $8,000. One evening she sat down at the kitchen table with brochures and acceptance forms. "I was accepted," she told her parents carefully. "I just need a little help to cover the first year." Robert Johnson barely looked at the paperwork Vivian slid across the table. He leaned back in his chair and laughed softly. "We're not spending that kind of money so you can learn to cook burgers," he said. Linda nodded in agreement from across the room. "You should think about getting a real career," she added. Vivian tried to explain how respected the institute was and how many successful chefs had graduated from there. Her father pushed the papers back toward her. "It's a waste of money," he said firmly. Vivian sat there quietly, realizing her parents had already made their decision. 2 months later, the Johnson driveway filled with balloons and celebration banners. Robert had just surprised Sophie with a brand new car for her 16th birthday. The shiny silver sedan sat proudly in front of the house while neighbors gathered to admire it. Vivian stood quietly on the porch watching the excitement. The car had cost over $20,000. "You deserve it, sweetheart," Linda told Sophie with a wide smile. Vivian slowly turned away and walked inside. Just weeks earlier her parents had said they could not help her find $7,000 for college. Yet somehow they had easily found money for this. That night Vivian sat alone in her room staring at the acceptance letter from the Culinary Institute. She had spent months applying for scholarships and grants, and one of them had finally come through. The school had offered her a 40% scholarship. It was a huge opportunity, but she still needed several $1,000s to make it work. Vivian had even prepared a repayment plan to show her parents she was serious. The next morning she tried once more. "It would only be a loan," she explained gently. Robert didn't even read the paper she offered him. "We already told you no," Robert said firmly without looking up from his coffee. Linda crossed her arms and added, "You should be grateful for everything we've already done for you." Vivian felt the familiar frustration rising inside her chest. "But you just bought Sophie a car," she said quietly. The room went silent for a moment. Robert's expression hardened immediately. "That's different," he replied. "Your sister's dance career has real potential." Vivian stared at him, stunned. "Cooking is just cooking," Linda said dismissively. "It's not something worth investing in." The words stayed with Vivian the entire day. That evening Sophie excitedly announced another opportunity at dinner. She had been accepted into an 8-week summer dance program in New York. The cost was $12,000. Robert didn't hesitate even for a second. "Of course we'll make it work," he said proudly. Linda smiled at Sophie like she had just announced something wonderful. Vivian sat frozen in her chair. She had asked for $7,000 to start her education. Her parents had refused. Yet $12,000 for dance training was suddenly no problem at all. Something inside Vivian quietly broke that night. She did not shout or argue anymore. Instead she asked one simple question. "How do you have $12,000 for Sophie but not $7,000 for my school?" Linda sighed like the conversation was exhausting. "Sophie's opportunity actually leads somewhere," she said coldly. Robert nodded in agreement. "Your cooking dream won't take you anywhere," he added. Vivian sat there in silence for several seconds. In that moment she finally understood something painful but clear. Her parents were never going to choose her. Not now and probably not ever. The next morning Vivian woke up to the sound of voices downstairs. At first she thought it was another normal day. But when she walked into the living room she froze. Her clothes, books and kitchen tools were stuffed into several large trash bags near the front door. Linda stood beside them with her arms crossed. Robert leaned against the wall with the same cold expression Vivian had seen the night before. "What's going on?" Vivian asked quietly. Linda did not hesitate. "You're 18 now," she said. "It's time for you to move out and learn how to stand on your own." Vivian stared at the bags for several seconds before the words finally reached her. "You're kicking me out?" she asked slowly. Robert shrugged as if it was the most reasonable decision in the world. "We're helping you become independent," he replied. Linda added, "We can't afford to keep feeding you while we're saving for Sophie's program." The sentence echoed in Vivian's mind. They had $12,000 for Sophie's dance training. But they could not afford food for their own daughter. Sophie stood halfway down the staircase watching the entire conversation without saying a single word. Vivian didn't cry. She didn't argue either. Instead, she quietly carried the trash bags to the old car she had been driving since high school. The engine rattled when she started it, but it still ran. She placed the last bag in the trunk and closed it slowly. For a moment she looked back at the house where she had grown up. No one came outside to stop her. No one said goodbye. Vivian slid into the driver's seat, started the car and drove away. That was the last time she ever lived under her parents' roof. The first few months were harder than anything Vivian had ever experienced. Her job at the diner barely paid enough for gas and food. Rent was impossible. When Mr. Turner heard what had happened, he immediately offered help. "You can stay with my family for a while," he told her one afternoon after school. Vivian tried to refuse at first, but he insisted. His wife welcomed her warmly and made sure she ate proper meals again. For the first time in years, Vivian felt what genuine support looked like. It came from people who were not even related to her. Vivian made a decision during those weeks on Mr. Turner's couch. She would delay culinary school for 1 year and save every dollar she could. Soon she found a second job washing dishes at a higher-end restaurant downtown. The work was exhausting and the hours were long. Many nights she worked nearly 16 hours between both jobs. But Vivian didn't complain. Every day in the kitchen taught her something new. One evening the head chef watched her carefully and finally said, "You're too talented to be stuck at the sink. Tomorrow you start on prep." The head chef's name was Chef Marco Alvarez, a strict and intimidating man who ran his kitchen with military precision. On Vivian's first day working prep, he handed her a crate full of vegetables and a sharp knife. "Let's see what you can do," he said. Vivian worked carefully, chopping onions, carrots, and celery with steady hands. Marco watched for several minutes before nodding slightly. "Your knife skills are good," he admitted. It was the first compliment she had heard from him. Vivian felt a quiet sense of pride. Every shift in that kitchen became another lesson she absorbed eagerly. The work was difficult, but Vivian loved every minute of it. She learned how to break down whole chickens, prepare stocks, and manage large quantities of ingredients quickly. Chef Marco rarely praised anyone, but he paid attention to her progress. One evening after service he called her over. "Talent alone means nothing," he said firmly. "Discipline is what creates great chefs." Vivian listened carefully and nodded. She understood exactly what he meant. Cooking was no longer just a hobby. It had become her path forward. And she was determined to prove that her dream was worth everything she was sacrificing. After 6 months of working non-stop, Vivian finally saved enough money to rent a small room in a shared house with 3 other young workers. The place was simple and crowded, but it was hers. She bought a small notebook where she wrote down every cooking technique she learned at the restaurant. Late at night she practiced recipes using cheap ingredients from the grocery store. Meanwhile, her parents filled social media with updates about Sophie's dance program in New York. Photos of performances, rehearsals, and fancy studios appeared almost every day. Vivian quietly unfollowed every account connected to her family. 1 year after leaving home, Vivian had finally saved enough to enroll at the Culinary Institute. Her scholarship still covered 40% of the tuition, and her savings paid for most of the remaining costs. She took a small student loan to cover the rest. Walking through the doors of the institute on her first day felt surreal. The kitchens were enormous, filled with professional equipment and students from across the country. Vivian immediately recognized how serious the program was. But instead of feeling intimidated, she felt ready. After everything she had already survived, hard work did not scare her. The training at the institute pushed Vivian harder than ever before. Students studied classical French techniques, modern cooking methods, wine pairings, and restaurant management. Many of her classmates struggled with the intensity of the program. Vivian thrived in it. She had already spent long nights working in professional kitchens. While others complained about the workload, she stayed late to practice new skills. One of her instructors eventually noticed her dedication. After tasting one of her dishes, he looked at her thoughtfully and said, "You don't just follow recipes. You understand flavors." Those words confirmed everything Vivian believed about her future. During her second year at the institute, Vivian earned an internship at a famous Michelin-starred restaurant in Chicago. The head chef there was Chef Elena Park, a respected figure known for her creative style and strict standards. Vivian felt both excited and nervous on her first day. The kitchen moved like a perfectly organized machine. Every cook knew their station and every movement had purpose. Chef Park watched Vivian carefully during the first week. One evening Vivian suggested a small change to one of the garnish combinations. Chef Park tasted it, paused for a moment and then smiled slightly. "You have good instincts," Chef Park told her. "Flavor balance like that cannot be taught easily." Vivian felt her confidence grow with every passing week. The internship demanded long hours and relentless attention to detail. But it also gave her the opportunity to work beside some of the best chefs in the industry. She learned how high-level kitchens operated, from ingredient sourcing to plate presentation. Chef Park became an important mentor during that time. She pushed Vivian to think creatively and trust her palate. For the first time, Vivian began to imagine owning a restaurant of her own someday. Vivian graduated from the Culinary Institute at the top of her class. The ceremony was small but meaningful to her. As she stood on the stage receiving her diploma, she noticed two familiar faces in the audience. Mr. Turner and his wife had traveled several hours to attend. They clapped proudly as Vivian smiled back at them. Her parents were not there. They had never asked about her graduation date. But Vivian no longer expected them to. The people who truly supported her were the ones who had chosen to stand beside her when she needed help. Shortly after graduation, Chef Park offered Vivian a full-time position as a line cook in her restaurant. Many graduates would have competed fiercely for such an opportunity. Vivian accepted immediately. Over the next 4 years she worked every station in the kitchen. She learned how to manage staff, control food costs, and design new dishes. Chef Park continued mentoring her closely. When the restaurant opened a second location, she selected Vivian to run the kitchen. At only 24 years old, Vivian became the head chef of a restaurant that soon earned its own Michelin star. The recognition changed Vivian's life almost overnight. Food critics began mentioning her name in reviews, and culinary magazines published articles about her work. Yet despite the growing fame, Vivian never forgot where she had started. 2 years later she decided it was time to take a bigger risk. With Chef Park's support and several investors, Vivian opened her own restaurant. She named it Ember House. The space was a renovated brick warehouse with an open kitchen and a small dining room for 60 guests. It was the restaurant where her dream finally became real. The first 6 months after Ember House opened were some of the most stressful months of Vivian's life. Running her own restaurant meant responsibility for everything. She planned the menu, managed suppliers, trained staff, and worked the line almost every night. Money was tight at first, and some evenings the dining room was only half full. Vivian often stayed in the kitchen until after midnight, reviewing expenses and planning improvements. Her sous chef, Carla Ramirez, became her most trusted partner in the restaurant. "We're building something special here," Carla told her one night after a long service. Slowly, word about Ember House began spreading through the city. Food bloggers started visiting and writing about Vivian's creative dishes. Critics praised her ability to combine comfort food with elegant techniques. Reservations began filling up days in advance. By the end of the first year, the restaurant had built a strong reputation among local diners. Vivian worked harder than ever to keep the standards high. Every plate leaving the kitchen had to represent her vision. When the Michelin Guide released its new list that year, Ember House received its first star. Vivian was only 27 years old. The night the Michelin announcement became public, Vivian sat quietly in her office reading the news article again and again. She had dreamed about that moment for years, yet it still felt unreal. Carla knocked on the door and rushed inside with excitement. "You did it," she said with a huge smile. The entire staff gathered in the dining room to celebrate. Vivian thanked each of them personally because she knew the success belonged to the whole team. Ember House was no longer just a restaurant. It had become a place where talented people worked together like family. For the first time in many years, Vivian felt truly stable. The restaurant was thriving, her team was strong, and the industry respected her work. She had built a life entirely on her own effort. That was why the reservation request that appeared one afternoon felt so strange. Carla was reviewing the weekend bookings when she noticed something unusual. "Vivian," she said slowly, pointing at the screen. "Does the name Johnson mean anything to you?" Vivian walked over and looked at the reservation. Party of 4. Last name Johnson. The hometown listed matched the town where she grew up. Vivian felt a sudden wave of tension move through her chest. After nearly 10 years of silence, her family had somehow found her restaurant. Carla studied her face carefully. "Is everything okay?" she asked. Vivian thought for a moment before answering. "It's my parents and my sister," she said quietly. Carla raised her eyebrows in surprise. "Do you want to cancel the reservation?" Vivian shook her head slowly. "No," she replied. "They can eat here like anyone else." Then she added one instruction to the reservation notes. "Standard service only. Nothing complimentary." Saturday evening arrived quickly, an Ember house filled with the quiet energy of a busy service. Vivian stood behind the kitchen pass while the dining room slowly filled with guests. When the host guided the Johnson family to their table, Vivian recognized them immediately. Robert Johnson looked older and Linda's hair had turned partly gray. Sophie Johnson sat beside them wearing an expensive dress while a man Vivian assumed was her boyfriend sat across from her. They glanced around the restaurant with impressed expressions. Vivian watched silently for a moment before turning back to the kitchen. Throughout the meal, Vivian made sure her team delivered the same excellent service every guest received. Course after course left the kitchen perfectly plated. The Johnson family ordered the full tasting menu for all 4 seats. The server later reported that they enjoyed the dishes but kept asking if the chef would come greet them personally. Vivian declined politely each time. Near the end of the meal, she finally walked to the table briefly. "Good evening," she said calmly. Her parents stared at her in surprise before Robert spoke. "Vivian, we came to reconnect." Vivian kept her voice calm and professional. "I'm glad you're enjoying the meal," she replied. Linda attempted to smile warmly. "We always knew you had talent," she said. Sophie added excitedly, "I've been posting pictures of the food for my followers." Vivian listened without reacting. 10 years earlier they had called her dream worthless. Now they spoke proudly as if they had supported her all along. "If you want to talk," Robert said, "maybe after your shift." Vivian shook her head politely. "Tonight I'm working," she answered. "Please enjoy the rest of your dinner." When the bill arrived at their table, the atmosphere changed quickly. Robert stared at the total in disbelief. The tasting menu, drinks, and automatic service charge brought the total close to $800. The server returned to the kitchen looking nervous. "They expected the meal to be free," he explained. Vivian wiped her hands calmly and walked to their table again. Robert spoke immediately. "Surely you're not charging your own family." Vivian met his eyes steadily. "Every guest pays for their meal," she said. "That's how this restaurant works." Robert reluctantly paid the bill, clearly furious. Linda looked at Vivian with tears forming in her eyes. "We just wanted to reconnect," she said softly. Vivian nodded calmly. "You had many years to do that," she replied. "Tonight you were guests in my restaurant and I treated you like every other guest." The family left the restaurant quietly. As the door closed behind them, the tension in the room disappeared. Vivian returned to the kitchen and continued service. Later that night, sitting alone in her office, she realized something important. She had finally built a life where she no longer needed their approval.